Brilliant. We are live, and welcome to another episode of Machine Medicine's Neuromodulation Today and Tomorrow interview series. And we're delighted today to have Krishnan Chakravarthy, who is both holds a medical post at UCSD, but also is accredited in the Department of Nanoengineering. And Krishnan, thank you very much for being with us today. We're going to talk about programming for spinal cord stimulation, but perhaps you would be so kind as to first give us a short bio of your background, how you got into this field, and why. Be interested to hear.
Yeah, sounds good. First of all, thanks, Jonathan, for taking the time. I always love doing these podcasts because it's just amazing the amount of stuff that I pick up on from the tough questions or not so tough questions you may or may not ask about a very complex topic. I grew up in Buffalo, New York. I did my undergraduate at the University of Chicago. I was a math and finance guy. And, I got stuck with the wonderful part of doing a long MD PhD program at SUNY Buffalo. So I spent 3 years working in viral immunology at the CDC, developing vaccines for 1918 flu. And I came back and briefly was interested in a lot of engineering stuff and vaccine development. So I kind of got my conceptual engineering concepts there during grad school. At that time, I was kind of thinking, hey, maybe I should just give this all up and do a startup in quantum dot space. I did actually form my first startup business in grad school. So I was kind of one of those crazy third-year medical students that had a side business that would come to rounds at the last minute, but I skied through that. And then I subsequently, during my fourth year of medicine, when I was trying to choose between specialties, I was deciding between neurosurgery and anesthesia. And my graduate mentor, he is phenomenal, one of the most prolific anesthesiologists. So he was like, listen, you just have a great research mind, and something about research and really developing the next generation physician scientists is having the time to do the research. You know, surgical specialties are quite demanding clinically, a lot harder to do balanced research and clinical work. So I decided to do anesthesia, went to Hopkins, and around my second year of rotation with the pain department, I really recognized how much I love being at the front end of patients, taking care of them. And then came back to Mass General, and now been a faculty at UCSD for the last 5 years, and I'm transitioning to starting up my own practice, as well as opening up a private research institute in Southern California, retaining my affiliation. The one thing I would say is pain medicine is I definitely think it's going through a renaissance time. A lot of people make this analogy about how cardiology was doing this in the 50s, and we're seeing pain medicine going through that same transition. I think there is such a breadth of new therapies, new technologies. And for me, I've been passionate about neuromodulation since I was a fellow. And given a lot of the engineering, building my own startups in the space, as well as advising a lot of the different Fortune 100 companies that have been operating in the spaces. And the thing that I tell my fellows at the end of the day is, getting to the foundations and the fundamentals of how these things work is going to dictate the major challenges that neuromodulation, beyond the conceptual variations in how we program, to the bigger challenges that we have in the space in terms of access, cost, and being able to get these therapies out to more people. You think about the market penetration of neuromodulation, it's about under 4%. So there's a lot of knowledge that is going to be needed in terms of moving this type of therapy forward into the broader mainstream.
Yeah, absolutely. But it sounds like you're already contributing in big ways to that. And so clinically, there's quite a difference between neurosurgery and anesthesiology, but you find that that anesthesiology complements your research interests just as well, if not better, in terms of leaving you enough time to do things. It's interesting to sort of consider, does anesthesiology naturally lead you towards spinal cord stimulation? It's typically done for pain? Maybe you could give us a quick overview of like where spinal cord stimulation comes from historically. It's more than half a century old, right? And how does it jibe?
Look, I think it's a fantastic question. So you think about what was in the 60s, or even way before it, and a lot of probably guests on this podcast have talked a little bit about, there's this famous analogy, history kind of repeats itself. How we decide things in human history in terms of the applications of things and knowledge getting translated to new technology. 3,000 years ago, Egyptians thought about using electricity as a way of pain control. So the classic example was you put patients dip them in the water with an electric eel that would send electrical stimulation at the point of when they were trying to suggest that gate control theory. They didn't ever have words or acronyms describing that. So around the late 60s, Wall and Melzack came up with this basic concept that if you use gate control theory, the basic principle is that ascending and descending inhibition through your peripheral nervous system all the way to your cortex, there's a component that electricity, everything in our body runs through electric current. Nerves communicate through electricity. There's a level of chemical action potentials that are generated every time ions move across gradients. So it isn't in the sense, it isn't surprising that it took a lot into the 60s to really coin that theory. But to the credit of Norman Shealy, was the first neurosurgeon who actually took that concept and applied it, where he essentially placed a electrical lead in a oncology patient and essentially tried stimulating, and he got about a day and a half worth of pain relief in a palliative care patient. So he had placed those leads in the subdural space. So the point in that was the first instance somebody took a concept or theory that was largely at that point accepted, that pain control was based on gate control, and he applied it in a clinical sense. And in the last 70 to 80 years, we have seen an incredible cascade of innovation that's surrounding neuromodulation. So we started with the movement of leads from the subdural to the epidural space. Then you really came to the process study, which was this idea that overlapping parastatic stimulation to the area of pain and this tingling sensations patients feel when you stimulate was correlative to better pain control, really was the dogma till around the early 2000s when you had subparastatic stimulation with high frequency therapy. And with that, you've seen a kind of a proliferation of different ways that people talk about stimulation, whether it's in the delivery model with closed loop stimulation, where you're sensing something and delivering, or you're changing the actual parameters around stimulation. So at the end of the day, the practical part of it is that when you think about what are you actually stimulating, what are the variables, really only 4 variables that you look at: pulse width, amplitude, frequency, and impedance. And impedance is just a byproduct of where you're actually putting in the leads. So if you're putting in the epidural space versus a different space. But all of those 3 parameters, it's been amazing how the combination of clinical and industry has really shaped different patterns that are being put into the nervous system, with the idea that you're really trying to solve long-term therapy durability and or looking at the impact of how do we keep these patients on these therapies for 3, 5, 7 years after implantation.
It's interesting in the way if I understood you correctly, you seem to make the argument there that actually the gate control theory of pain was instrumental in driving the first kind of the first developments of spinal cord stimulation. Anyway, what do you think? What are your thoughts about? I mean, I guess at some level, gate control theory of pain is at least incomplete, right? But
Yes.
Maybe even kind of wrong. And so, is it still driving innovation now, or are we more? I guess some alternative argument that actually this whole field's been driven by serendipity and incorrect theories, which led to interesting experiments, which serendipitously.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a good point. It's not that, again, when you say theories can be proven or disproven. I mean, I think we've understood when you think about pain from a clinical perspective, I think we have to appreciate that cultural, environmental context. When the original gate control theory, we defined pain as what's called nociception versus global, right? So what separates nociceptive pain from global pain is that nociception can't articulate the environmental, the emotional component of pain that any one individual feels in terms of how they respond to this. So I'll give you a good example. So when there was a really interesting study that was comparing male neonates in the ICU to female neonates in the ICU. And what really led to pediatric anesthesiologists ever thinking about kids being responsive to opiates was a very interesting thought experiment, which was finding that if you looked at the response time for exogenous opiates originally, female neonatal babies had a lot less or a lot more robust response for some reason. So they couldn't quite understand that. Why would kids, just based on gender, yes, we know gender differences change the way we interpret pain, but the point in that was that if kids that are in the ICU for longer periods of time that have repeated interventions through needle sticks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, not only were there gender differences, but they were seeing that the short to long-term response to these kids and getting into adolescence was very different in terms of how they responded to exogenous opiates. Amazing set of experiments when they were looking at that. So the point here is that pain is an extremely complex topic. It's not today that I think you're going to find an isolated device that's going to fix every aspect of that. Pain is multifactorial. There's a lot that we do with the interpretation. The second part of that we understand from gate control theory to today is that a lot of pain is also neuroinflammatory. So the last 5-10 years, we've understood that a lot of chronic inflammation drives this mechanism. So when you think about more modern waveforms, the big challenge when you think about dosing and what I would love for the stimulation industry to do is to standardize the way we develop therapies very similar to the pharmacologic world. They have a set sequence of preclinical work, you have a mechanistic concept that you've developed, and then you translate that to a sequential set of clinical studies that then help move the field forward. What's happening today is a lot of these developments are in isolation. So one waveform may be stipulated for helping pain and suffering. A different waveform may be looked at, this is effectively targeting inflammation. Yeah. So I think needs to be more consistency across the different platforms to say what it is that we're mechanistically changing.
Yeah, and I think you put your finger on a super important point, and the way it seems to me sometimes is that in pharmaceutical development, you basically have static therapeutic entities, right? It's a drug, and then it gets put onto the clinical treadmill and goes through phase 1, phase 2. With neuromodulation, it's a bit like, one way of thinking about it is kind of just like a programmable drug. It's morphable. It can change, and so you have this sort of this changeable entity, and it really does kind of throw a spanner in the works when considered with that sort of traditional model of having a static entity that we can check this, check that.
Yeah, and I think, Jonathan, every specialty and field goes through phases of development, and I coined the word electroceutical. We're in a renaissance time in the electroceutical industry, but what we do need to do is we're getting to the point where everybody looks at, how do I change one aspect of the care delivery model? Am I changing the programming? Am I changing the architecture of what I'm delivering? How I'm delivering it? But to really get down to it, the big challenge for the neuromodulation space, we still continue to ask this critical question is, if I change the dosing paradigms around pulse width, amplitude, and frequency, no matter whether you look at what was happening with traditional tonic, and you look at traditional tonic stimulation, that's been probably the most validated in terms of all the different therapy waveforms, the data supports about a 10 to 40% explant rate. And that's a large number that when you think about the cost of these devices going into uses for today, how do we better design more standardization across development so that we're addressing the critical issue on maintenance of these therapies? Because make no mistake, I mean, at the end of the day, cost savings is what drives healthcare. You can have a great therapy, but it has to make cost sense for the entire different parties involved. So I think there's definitely a component of that I think dosing is a part of it, and how we approach dosing in terms of spinal cord stimulation. But we also need to address how the innovations that are happening in the space, can they be more cost effective for more durable therapy?
Yeah. I want to. It's such an interesting topic. I want to read a quote from your very enjoyable paper that I have here in front of me, and I think gets down to some of. So you mentioned that but you're trying to maximize therapeutic effects and minimize side effects, and you say clearly this mirrors the approach of pharmaceuticals. Unfortunately, the field of SCS has yet to adequately describe an electrical equivalent of pharmacokinetics stroke pharmacodynamics that can be used as a guide for dosing. Instead, dosing decisions are usually empirical based on observation. We kind of that's this seems like a fundamental issue, right? That we don't. It seems to me that another way of putting what you've said there is that we need to know we need to understand what the neural code, the language of the neural code for pain is, right? Before we can achieve that. Is that the situation? Do you think?
I think so.
A minimal challenge?
Yeah, look, I think so. Look at the way. I mean, cardiology benefits because a lot of their outcomes are objective, right? Today, I can ask, hey, Jonathan, today you come to my clinic and you tell me, what does your pain score? A pain score is arguably the best currently regulatory approved metric that we're using to develop a lot of these therapies.
Yeah.
Now, we're talking a lot about objectifying something that, the start of this conversation is very complex. Jonathan today might have had a bad day, comes in and he may say, hey, look, my pain score is an 8 out of 10 because, my kid was stomping on my feet. And even though I'm talking to you about back pain and just the mood part of it. So I'll give you a really interesting analogy. There was a New York Times article about 3 years ago that said that if you gave somebody a sugar pill, the placebo effect of just giving somebody a sugar pill was about a 40% improvement in pain scores. Can you imagine I can give you the total placebo and you could say, oh, I've got about a 40% improvement. So I think the challenge for being stringent to delivering something that's extremely engineering based, where you have very definitive control over set parameters, but to apply it to a very subjective assay, which is pain. If you think about it in the same way as a pharmacology, I think that's the big difference. And I think your point's really well taken. Unless you really study these mechanisms in the context of how better we understand pain that's subjective to the transition to an objective outcome, how better are you going to better inform dose titration? There's always going to be that gap in the sensitivity of the indicators that you're using to titrate are just not as fast as the innovations that you're doing on the therapy side.
Yeah, and then we have all these issues around, as you said, 40% improvement for placebo effect for a sugar pill, but probably huge individual differences, right? And maybe some people that have nothing, other people that have like 80%, and not the average is 40, but.
Yeah, and I've said this a lot in a lot of talks that I give. I do see neuromodulation going the same direction as what cancer therapy went to, which is much more personalized. What I envision the future will be is if you can tie looking at someone's genetic composition, somebody's blood work, somebody's physiologic vital signs to therapy endpoints with the different types of therapy modalities that are out there. It's very similar to the idea that one chemotherapy drug didn't work for every cancer. You almost had to specialize what drug treatments you were doing for specific individuals. Now, can we get there? Can we start to think about, see 23andMe has done a really interesting concept. People now talk about the lineages and how we're of different genetic makeup. So I think the real future for pain medicine is, one, devices need to be more low cost, which increases access, which allows people to understand better their unique capability. But we also need to tie more holistic outcomes. That is, how does someone's genetic profile down to the molecular cellular level change with different stimulation patterns? And I think that's going to be critical for what the future of this really the space is going to be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And it's kind of maybe a bit of a false dichotomy, but are you betting on, is the solution to this, if you had $10 million to deploy, or maybe you do, but let's just hypothetically say that you have, would you put this behind kind of like tools for big data collection, or tools for more accurate personalized models of
Uh,
patients? Where would you bet?
I love that. I love that question because it's exactly where I'm going. So what we launched is, we're looking at a campaign. It's really interesting. It's called Better Together. It's looking at cost, access, and community around the neuromodulation space. So the basic idea is, we're looking at a low cost system today. That's around $200 that will be free to the patient, but eventually a patient could buy off a website, similar to an iPhone. The beauty of what we're trying to do is we're using large data gathering across using AI ML technology. So basically today, if Jonathan uses, let's say there's about 100 plus different waveforms. Jonathan uses waveform X for a certain pain descriptor. Yeah. Does Krishnan in India use the same waveform or a different waveform? And what can happen is, as you collect all of that data in aggregate, tens and thousands of different data points, you start to see whether specific waveforms apply with certain dosing patterns to certain demographic of patients for back pain. And that's really powerful. The only way you can do that is with a low cost system. You can't do that when your implantable ASP costs are $20,000 because the care delivery model doesn't support the data. I think we are onto something here. We have a solution for that, and it's now rolling out in the United States. And what's amazing about what we're doing is the incredible amount of data that we're collecting around patients. It's their prescribing patterns, their compliance, where they're placing these units to stimulate. And what's ironic about that is that we've got our first sets of patients in India and Africa. And so the demographic and the cultural changes to see how people use these different devices in different parts of the world, it's really interesting. I mean, it just lends itself to a very interesting comment that a lot of pain space says. We have great randomized controlled trial data, but how come it never makes sense in my own practice? Why can't I make it match the same set of outcomes? Yeah. Well, in a controlled study setting, you're extremely particular about your inclusion criteria. The pain, no two patients walk in the door that are identical. So I completely agree with you. I think big data is the future for pain medicine in the way it drives therapy adoption. And to some extent, I would love to see waveforms that go off patents, because then we can actually get to the real innovation, which is cost, access, and hardware. It's too complicated, the delivery model today. All of the technologies take so much money to develop, it doesn't make sense for the broad masses. So my point is, if the patent office never patented 10,000 hertz, we'd be having a totally different conversation. You might have a neuromodulation device on today. You'd be like, hey, Dr. Chakravarthy, this is what my device is saying for X, Y, and Z uses. But I think that's changing, and it's accepted. I think the industry is moving in that direction.
What do you see an analogy between this sort of evolution of, we've talked a bit about, cardiology 30 or 40 years ago, and the changes that, well, really, I mean, pacing and similar technologies are really kind of neuromodulation for excitable cardiac tissue. But another industry I think that's very interesting to consider an analogy with, and I'd be interested to know your thoughts on how deep that is general computing, where we saw in the 80s, IBM was building huge mainframe computers. It was at one point the most profitable company in the USA. By 95, that whole thing had turned on its head, and Microsoft, the software company, was leading the charge. And I just wonder if you see something similar happening, whereas, as you said, the focus at the moment is on miniaturizing and commoditizing the hardware, and only once that's done can we really see, these systems have their true potential impact on various conditions?
You're right, and that's a fantastic point. Today, majority of the innovation in the neuromodulation space, I think, is incremental software developments. I put in one waveform, I change a set frequency, I change a set pulse pattern, FDA approves it in the same hardware, and now I've got something else. The problem is that we don't, if you go back and you say, well, how do I know how impactful this is to the larger audience of pain patients? Again, we don't really emphasize comparator trials. A lot of your guests, I'm sure, never really say, hey, Jonathan, I've compared this waveform to something else. So the cardiologists, the lesson they learned was they made guidelines that were strictly objective. So you couldn't bring in a new stent unless you showed a better improvement in cardiac output or perfusion, which is an objective outcome, right? So you're right. The computing industry is a better analogy in some ways of the way the innovation is happening in our space. But I think why I go back to hardware being a driver in this is, if you think about 4% market penetration in the United States, there's about 50.2 million chronic pain patients. We're doing about 100,000 implants. That's a massive level of disparity in terms of access. And the rate of access isn't really growing the way you would think with all of the additional data and evidence that we have. So which makes me think that the complexity of the care model as it stands today is just not relevant to making that happen. So I think hardware has to be solved for before we get back to that transition again and say, well, what's meaningful software improvements to the nervous system?
That's fascinating. So, and do you think so? So incremental changes in software, and there's nowhere near as many changes being made to the hardware. And do you think that's because if you modify your hardware, is it much harder to get it past the FDA than if you modify your software? Is that the basic issue? So
that's the basic issue.
Wow.
So the analogy I give is, and it's a simple one, or taking it what it is. So when the Apollo mission went to the moon, that was in the 1960s. The computational capability was what they did with the TI-82 calculator. Your iPhone today has way more capability. The beauty of it is that technology has advanced. It's the direction that you're pointing that technology to. So is it possible to change the entire infrastructure of the hardware? Absolutely. Is there an incentive to do that? Maybe less so, because you're absolutely right. It's a huge pathway, it's 7 years, a lot of investments, and it's a lot easier to do something that has the ability to change software, where FDA looks at it as, okay, well, from a safety perspective, it's not a big deal. Just delivering a different waveform. And if you've got something that's got a huge scope of uses, you hear everything from now we're doing ultra low hertz frequency to 10,000 hertz to now different forms of ascending and descending charge accumulation to multiplexed frequencies on the cord. I mean, wonderful. No doubt these are all important, but are they fundamental shifts in the way neuromodulation is going? I don't see it yet, but I'm certainly working hard to try to make some changes, at least on the access and the hardware cost standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it almost seems, I mean, because what we'd like in neuromodulation, right, is something that's basically kind of like Turing complete for neuromodulation. Like you can treat any condition with it. You've got some kind of hardware interface, and it can receive an arbitrary program, and it can potentially, in some medical sense, it's Turing complete. In some neurological sense. And so that would be the kind of the dream. And it's, if I understand your point correctly, they're kind of like all these like, oh, well, let's get the stimulation, the possibility for stimulation rates up to 15,000, 20,000. That's a bit like just improving your sort of your sign function on your calculator without actually.
It almost seems to me like I go back to the pharmacology word. It's like you're doing PK/PD studies, pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic studies for 25, 30 years, because if you don't understand the full mechanisms of all the different areas. So the classic example, I put a 2-lead dipole in the spinal cord. We've been asking the impact of neurons. Now we've shifted that conversation. Well, what actually is in the spinal? Oh wow, 90% of it are glial cells. So the
Yes.
most logical people would have been said, well, if I put the cord on spinal cord stimulation, I'd be asking what all the impact of every different cell is, and then I would go to what are the variables that I would be changing. Then I would go to, So I think it's not that we haven't come a long way. It's incredible the amount of innovation, but I think that if we could standardize things, the speed of that would be way more faster and much more logical.
Yeah. It's very interesting. Yeah, gets back to you. So with the glial cells, it's particularly interesting. Do we think mechanistically what's happening there is that the electrical stimulation is basically being mediated by the membrane potential of the glial cells, and then that's having some kind of effect upon transcription? They're releasing transcribing a new profile of factors that ideally reduces inflammation, and that's the sort of mechanistic essence. Is that right?
That's spot on. So I mean, what we do know is that the glial cells have multiple variable phenotypes. Classically, when you have an infection or a virus, you have a pro-inflammatory phenotype that inflammation in short course is how the body deals with injury or external effect. That should subside. Now, a lot of set aside. Neuromodulation, there's incredible amount of evidence in labs all over the world that have shown that persistent inflammation has a critical component of discogenic pain, that has a critical component of a lot of different pain patterns like CRPS, small fiber neuropathy. What we've understood is with good genetic data that it is in fact possible that when you stimulate, you can actually revert these from a pro-inflammatory to an anti-inflammatory phenotype. The beauty of that is that glial cells by themselves are very important components of how the body responds to things. It's the redundancy. It migrates everywhere. It goes from your abdomen to your spinal cord. And so what then happens is that impact goes to the nervous system too. So here's the beauty of something like this, and this is what I would love industry to do. So most people will say, great, company X has some IP over this, and glial cells is a real fundamental shift in thinking. Should company Y make the same claims that we're affecting glial cell pathology when we stimulate because we're getting eventual improvement in pain control? Or could now we see that the impact of stimulation on glial cells is a new standard with which therapy development happens in our space? And that's the whole point. I mean, I think if we can get to that level, then the conversation becomes much more, I would say, systematic or precise. Otherwise, it's, sure, you may or may not be affecting glial cells. No one has a sense on what direction that's going. And then somebody else will look at, the classic example, medial versus lateral pathway, suffering versus, a lot of the original natural part of it. So we could study that. I would love that to be much more standardized.
Absolutely. But to get so on that sort of point, say glial cell, gene expression could be a really objective kind of metric that we could use. But to get to the essence that you mentioned earlier on of pain being a subjective sort of state, and yet there is still a significant body of research. For example, Irene Tracy's fMRI work at Oxford, I'm somewhat familiar with, looking at trying to actually find objective correlates of that subjective state. What are your thoughts? Is that not a prospect?
I think it goes back to, I think your point that maybe the big take home is absolutely, but a single test isn't going to be enough. It's going to be, again, goes back to me, I think big data is the answer. So it's a combination of MRI. Is there a blood test? Is there a genetic test? All of those correlates to how do I quantify the VAS score that you're telling me? Because at the end of the day, right now, we don't have any other better way, and it may be very difficult to really objectively say, somebody who says I'm in a 10 out of 10 pain, are you I get the philosophical conundrum there, and this is what a lot of people debate. If an fMRI shows that there is no pain and somebody says I'm in pain, where do you draw the line? Is it an emotional part of it? Is it something that is it truly as sensitive an indicator? And I think when you look at all of the composite data and you approach it in a big data setting, then I think it's going to make a huge difference to our specialty. But to do that, it really has to be disciplined in consistency of studies that make the investments to look at those outcomes. So if you have a lab that's looking at fMRI, if you have a lab that's looking only at genetics, if you have a lab, you have to almost have to standardize that across all the pain studies to start to gather that big data style. But I think that is definitely the future. I don't think it's going to be a single test or a single image that is going to drive what is a VAS score.
Are there any lessons from, you mentioned the oncology space, which I think is definitely very relevant. Were there any innovations that you're familiar with there that we could maybe copy over in neuromodulation? Because like you said, we now have personalized chemotherapy is much more widely practiced and accepted.
I think the big lesson is, I see what a new field always struggles with is how do you create a common voice? Today, the pain specialty is challenged by so many national societies, international societies. I mean, Jonathan, you could do a podcast literally every day. There's probably that many societies and that many speakers that you would be interested in. So the point I'm trying to make is, unless you get consensus across these different platforms across the world, so in the United States, there's about 6,000 pain clinicians, give or take. And note, I can tell you, only interventional pain is probably penetrating about 1,000 of them. There's about 5,000 pain clinicians that don't do any of these therapies. And the challenge around education and broad understanding of neuromodulation in academic programs. So what happens, though, is when you think about what cardiology did, what did they do? They consolidated to one or two big societies that set the guidelines and standards for therapies getting adopted. So you had to have a certain set of data that allowed you to enter the space and have physicians actually apply the therapy. So I think we're in a time where if we come together and say, these are the metrics that define innovation in our space, and what is it in neuromodulation that is required for a new company enter, an existing company enter to make a software innovation, it's not going to be interesting to hear that, oh, you needed to spend X more dollars to get to that point. But it will definitively change the innovation cycle to be much more rigorous and standardized. And I think that has to start with broad scale guidelines and recommendations that are much more prescriptive on what it is that we're measuring. If you don't know what you're quantifying, then VAS scores by itself aren't going to be enough, as I would say. Because that's what we're comfortably doing right now, VAS and NRS. And you don't think which are still subjective.
And the International Neuromodulation Society, that isn't the.
I think they're doing a great job. It's just that I think it is how much can a society influence the way the changes in development of industry around these new therapies. We've done a great job in new RCTs, but I would love all of the clinical to be standardized the same development, so that you see kind of that ability to say, oh, if something's affecting glial cells, great. I've looked at that. I've looked at the genetics. I've looked at the protein. I've looked at fMRI in the clinical setting as a pilot before I run large RCTs. So cost is a definite impact in that, but at least we have those sets of conversations.
Krishnan, that's very interesting. I'm conscious of time, but one thing that does strike me is that it's so interesting. We've been talking about their problems largely in this space, and whereas initially I came with the expectation that we'd be talking about technical problems, but what's clear from what we've been saying is that so much of this is kind of organizational and cultural, and to do with changing minds, right?
Yeah.
Unintended.
Yeah. Look. I think no matter what, Jonathan, I would say neuromodulation is a phenomenal therapy. There are people who have incredibly benefited in my practice with it. I had a fascinating story of somebody with phantom limb pain for 18 years that I placed a DRG stimulator and did fantastic. I mean, pain-free. Would have been, in any other circumstance, you look at how impactful it has been for his life, it's been life-altering. What I think will be determining the next 15, 20 years in our specialty is all of the other things around how does innovation help people get more of this therapy. And I think that for that to happen, we do have to make some broad-scale educational and policy as well as access changes, or innovation has to support a much different approach of therapy, how it's delivered, I would say.
All right. Krishnan, thanks so much for your time. It's been an education and a pleasure. And we'll look forward to watching your future progress and further work with great interest.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Jonathan.
No problem.